In a small town, Mike Thompson struggled to keep his handyman business alive. With barely enough money for his own bills, he still spent 2 weeks fixing an elderly widow's crumbling house for free. He saw how Mrs. Anderson reminded him of his own mother, and he couldn't walk away. 3 months later, a letter arrived that changed his life forever. Hi everyone, welcome to Mythos Weaver. Today, I am excited to share a new story with you. Mike Thompson sat at his kitchen table, sorting through unpaid bills. The electricity bill was overdue by 2 weeks. His phone kept buzzing with payment reminders. He looked at his old pickup truck parked outside. The rust spots were getting bigger. The truck needed repairs, but Mike had to choose between fixing it or paying his bills. His handyman business was barely staying afloat. Most people in town chose bigger companies over his one-man operation. The few jobs he got hardly covered his basic needs. Mike picked up his morning coffee. The mug was chipped, just like everything else in his small rental house. At age 35, he thought his life would be different. The morning newspaper caught his eye. Mrs. Anderson, a widow in her 70s, needed urgent home repairs. Her house was falling apart, but she couldn't afford professional help. Mike remembered his mother, who passed away 5 years ago. Mrs. Anderson lived just 3 blocks away. He decided to look at her house, just to check the damage. The old Victorian house needed serious work. The porch steps were broken. The gutters hung loose. Paint peeled off the walls like old wallpaper. Mrs. Anderson opened the door slowly. Her white hair was neatly combed, but her clothes looked worn out. Her hands shook as she held her walking cane. I saw your ad in the paper, but I should tell you right away, I cannot afford much. My pension barely covers food and medicine, she said softly. Mike walked around the house. The repairs would take at least 2 weeks. The materials alone would cost hundreds of dollars. He knew he should walk away. Mrs. Anderson followed him slowly. Maybe you could just fix the steps. I fell last week. The hospital bill took my savings. Mike saw the fear in her eyes. She reminded him so much of his mother in her final years. His mother also lived alone, proud but struggling. Mrs. Anderson, I will fix everything, the steps, gutters, walls, everything that needs repair, Mike heard himself say. Her eyes widened. But I told you I cannot pay. Mike smiled gently. No charge. My mother taught me that sometimes we need to help others just because we can. Tears filled Mrs. Anderson's eyes. She reached for Mike's hand. Her grip was weak but warm. Your mother raised a good man. Mike drove home that evening. His own bills sat unpaid on the kitchen table. But for the first time in months, he felt something change inside him. The next morning, Mike loaded his tools into his truck. The old engine coughed twice before starting. He had enough savings for 2 weeks of supplies. At the hardware store, Mike carefully selected materials. He chose sturdy wood for the porch steps. The paint would need 3 coats to last through winter. The store owner, Tom, watched Mike calculate prices. Big job. I haven't seen you buy this much before. Mike nodded slowly. Fixing up Mrs. Anderson's house. The whole place needs work. Tom raised his eyebrows. That old place on Cedar Street? Heard she's been struggling since her husband died. The total came to $300. Mike handed over his last credit card. The machine declined it twice before accepting. At Mrs. Anderson's house, Mike started with the dangerous porch steps. The wood had rotted through completely. No wonder she fell. Mrs. Anderson brought him water in a glass. Her hands trembled less today. My Harold built these steps 30 years ago. Mike worked steadily through the morning. The summer heat made his shirt stick to his back. His phone rang twice, with bill collectors. He ignored them. By afternoon, the new steps looked solid. Mrs. Anderson tested them carefully. They feel so sturdy. Harold would have approved. She sat in her porch chair watching Mike work. She told stories about her life, about Harold's hardware store that closed 20 years ago. "We had good years," she said softly. "But medical bills took everything at the end. Harold wanted me to sell the house. I couldn't do it." Mike understood. This house held her memories. He saw it in how she touched the walls, how she knew every creaky floorboard. Each day Mike arrived early. The gutters needed complete replacement. Water damage had spread into the walls. Mrs. Anderson always had coffee ready. "Too hot for you to work without breakfast," she insisted. Her coffee tasted like his mother's. She showed Mike old photos while he ate. Her husband looked strong and kind in them. "He could fix anything," she said proudly. Mike noticed she ate very little herself. Her kitchen cabinets were nearly empty. Still, she tried sharing her small meals with him. The repairs took more time than planned. Mike's own bills piled higher, but watching Mrs. Anderson walk safely up her new steps made it worth it. His phone kept ringing with unpaid notices. At night he worried about his choices, but each morning seeing Mrs. Anderson's grateful smile renewed his purpose. Mrs. Anderson grew stronger each day. The safe porch steps helped her move more freely. She spent more time outside, watching Mike work. During breaks, she shared her lunch with Mike. Simple sandwiches cut into careful triangles. "My Harold loved his sandwiches this way," she smiled. Mike noticed small details about her life, how she saved every penny, how she mended her old clothes instead of buying new ones. One morning, Mrs. Anderson seemed quieter than usual. She held an old photo of Harold. "Today would have been our 50th anniversary." Mike worked on the walls that day. Each paint stroke covered years of neglect. The house slowly came back to life. Mrs. Anderson watched the transformation. "The color matches perfectly." "How did you know?" "I found the original paint can in your garage," Mike said. Still had the label from Harold's store. Tears formed in her eyes. "You remind me so much of him, always thinking of details others would miss." Mike's phone rang again, the bank warning about his mortgage payment. He stepped away to take the call. "We can't extend the deadline any further, Mr. Thompson," the bank officer said. Mike felt his stomach tighten. Mrs. Anderson noticed his worry. "Money troubles?" she asked gently. "I wish I could pay you for all this work," Mrs. Anderson said softly. Mike shook his head. "Please don't worry about that. Your company reminds me of good times with my own mother." The repairs continued. Mike fixed loose shingles on the roof and replaced broken window frames. His savings account hit zero. Tom from the hardware store started letting Mike take supplies on credit. "Pay when you can," he said. "We look after our own here." Mrs. Anderson's neighbor, Sarah, brought dinner one evening. She watched Mike work until sunset. Nobody's been this kind to Mrs. Anderson in years. The house improved day by day. Mrs. Anderson walked straighter and smiled more. She spent evenings in her garden again. Meanwhile, Mike's landlord called about late rent and his electricity got cut off at home. Still, he kept working, determined to finish the job. Every morning, Mrs. Anderson met him with fresh coffee and a warm smile. Sometimes that smile was all that kept him going. As the second week ended, Mike noticed Mrs. Anderson walking slower. Her usual morning coffee wasn't ready when he arrived. "Just feeling tired today," she said. But Mike noticed how she held her chest while breathing and how she sat down more often. Sarah, the neighbor, started coming by more frequently. One afternoon, she whispered to Mike, "Mrs. Anderson refuses to go to the doctor again." Mike worked faster, feeling a strange urgency. The house still needed finishing touches, but the major repairs were done. Mrs. Anderson now watched from her window instead of the porch. Her face looked paler each day, but she still smiled when Mike arrived. One morning, Sarah met Mike at the door. Her eyes were red. "They took her to the hospital last night. Her heart." Mike visited her after work. The hospital room felt cold. Mrs. Anderson looked small in the white bed, but her eyes lit up when she saw him. "The house," she whispered. "Is it finished?" "Almost done," Mike said. "Just small details left. The paint needs a final coat and some spots." She reached for his hand. Her grip felt weaker than before. "You made it beautiful again, like when Harold was alive." Mike sat with her for hours. She told stories about Harold, their life together, and the house when it was new. "Promise me something," she said softly. "Finish the house, even if. Just finish it." Mike worked through the weekend. He painted every spot he'd missed, fixed every tiny crack, and made everything perfect. His own life was falling apart. The bank called about his truck payments, and his landlord gave him a final notice. But he kept working. Sarah brought updates from the hospital. Mrs. Anderson asked about the house every day, even asking if Mike was taking care of himself. The final repairs took 3 more days. Mike put everything he had into them, every skill, every minute, every last dollar. When he finished, the house looked like new. It was as if Harold himself had restored it. 3 weeks after completing the house, Mike got a call from Sarah. Mrs. Anderson had passed away peacefully in her sleep. The funeral was small. Mike stood at the back of the church. His suit was old, borrowed from a friend, and his truck barely made it there. A week later, a letter arrived at Mike's door. It came from Mrs. Anderson's lawyer. Mike opened it with shaking hands. "Please come to my office," the letter read, regarding the last wishes of Mrs. Eleanor Anderson. Mike drove to the lawyer's office the next morning. His truck stalled twice, and the parking meter took his last quarters. The lawyer, Mr. Peters, looked serious. Mrs. Anderson changed her will 3 days before she passed. Mike sat quietly, confused. He didn't understand why he was there. "She left you her house, Mr. Thompson, and her savings, all of it." Mike couldn't speak. The lawyer pushed a document forward. Mrs. Anderson's handwriting filled the last page. "To Mike Thompson, who showed me kindness when I needed it most, who reminded me of my Harold, who fixed not just my house, but my spirit." The lawyer explained more. The house was paid for, and the savings account held enough to cover repairs for years. "She wrote this too," Mr. Peters said, handing Mike a sealed envelope. Inside, Mrs. Anderson's careful handwriting told one last story about watching Mike work through his own struggles to help her. "You gave everything to help me," she wrote. "Now I can help you. Harold would have wanted this. He always said good hearts deserve good things." Mike drove to the house, his house now. He climbed the steps he had built, each step solid, each step a memory. Inside, everything remained as she left it. Photos of Harold and small treasures from their life surrounded him. And now, Mike had a chance to start again. He sat on the porch where Mrs. Anderson used to watch him work. The evening sun turned the fresh paint golden. Sarah walked by, smiling through tears. "She talked about you in the hospital," she said. "She said God sent her an angel disguised as a handyman." Mike looked at his worn tools in the truck. Tomorrow, he would park it in his new garage and start his business again, the right way. Sometimes, the biggest gifts come from the smallest kindnesses, from choosing to help when walking away would be easier. Love this story? Tap that like button and subscribe to Mythos Weaver for more. Let us know how this story made you feel with a single word in the comments.